Welcome everyone to the Maintenance Mavericks Podcast, where we talk about trends in maintenance, reliability, and asset operations. My name is Ryan. I'm the CEO and founder of UpKeep, which is an asset operations management system. So for today's guest, I'm super excited to welcome Bob DiStefano here on the show. Bob is the COO at Performance Consulting Associates and also a longtime maintenance and reliability expert with over 43 years of experience in our space. He was previously the founder and CEO of Management Resources Group, MRG, which he ran for 29 years before he sold that to Emerson Electric in 2014. A little bit more about Bob. He's passionate about the industry, shows this through your commitment and involvement within the Society of Maintenance Reliability Professionals, SMRP, which I'm also very, very active in too. You're also a super active industry leader and also volunteer board member. So really appreciate all the work that you do for our industry. And also, just as a side note, I recently learned that you're also one of the first people to ever receive a CMRP certification. So congrats about that.
That just means I'm old.
Bob, in your free time, it sounds like, when you're not working, you also love spending time at the beach or in Italy, discovering new restaurants and also doing some wine tasting. So welcome to the podcast, Bob. Really excited to have you. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Ryan. Doing great. Would be better if I was in Italy drinking wine, but other than that, I'm pretty happy.
You're here with us. You got me.
That's right.
All right. Well, again,
glad to be here.
Really excited to have you here on the show, Bob. The way that we always kick things off is have you share a little bit more about yourself, your background, and how you were first introduced to this, what I think small little niche, but wonderful field of maintenance reliability. And would love to hear your journey of, getting to where you are today too.
Oh, well, I guess it started, there was some luck involved in me ending up in this niche that you'd call it, and I love it as well. It's been a lifelong passion for me. I left college and went to go work for a power company, which had a nuclear division. And after about a year, I ended up in that nuclear division working at the company's nuclear plant. And I might argue that in retrospect now, having been at this for 44 years, the two industries that I think spawned a lot of the early learnings of reliability are the aviation industry and the nuclear power industry, both places where failures, particularly catastrophic failures, the consequences of those failures are significant and unacceptable. So I worked at a nuclear plant, and there were chronic degradation problems of a safety system that was critical to maintaining the operating license for that plant. And as a result of that strategic value of making sure that that safety system would always be ready to perform its service in the case that it was called upon, the executive management team of the company, they were very, very keen on making sure that everybody worked together, that whatever money needed to be spent was spent on maintaining that equipment properly. So the let's call it the strategic business case for getting reliability right was very, very high. That's the same holds true in the aviation industry. That the work that spawned reliability centered maintenance, as you know, Ryan, started with the introduction of the 747 and the work that was done in the 1960s. Think about that, a long time ago, 50 years ago. A lot of the knowledge that we have today came from those two industries. So I was kind of lucky, and I worked with some amazing engineers who were the best engineers in the company. Again, the company spent lots of money hiring experts from different parts of the world, leaders in their fields. And I was lucky enough as a young engineer to work side by side with these people, really learning the art of root cause failure analysis and what to do about mitigating failures. So that's how I got my start.
All right. And to your point, like we always talk about like the birth of this industry, and you're totally right. It started out in aviation, And what we've kind of seen is taking the best practices from one industry, aviation, and being able to apply, maybe not every single component of it, but different components of it to, almost every single industry. And I think that's kind of like what we've really seen over the last, not just 50 years, we're in 2022 now, so almost 60 years.
It's true. It's incredible. I agree with you. When I left that power company, I went to go work for a consulting company that serviced the nuclear power industry. And I started a maintenance engineering division for them in anticipation of the federal government introducing a maintenance rule that would have required all nuclear plants in the country to elevate their maintenance practices.
Yeah.
And that's how I got in the consulting space. But 6 or 7 years into that journey, the nuclear industry really suffered. New plants were not being licensed anymore. And all of the big companies like GE and Westinghouse were now focusing down on the services market. And we had a lot more competition and less work to do. There were only 88 plants in the country at the time. And so I started trying to call on chemical companies to see if the practices that I had learned, I didn't know these weren't day-to-day understood practices outside of my industry. But I learned that fairly quickly. In the chemical processing industry, I was appalled, really shocked at the condition of the equipment and the lack of best practices that were deployed there. So, but the CEO of the company I worked for didn't like veering outside of his hedgehog, outside of the nuclear industry. And so, when I was 29 years old, I saw an opportunity and I started my own company. And that led to my long career here in the nuclear power and in the commercial industry outside of the nuclear power world. So I ended up working in 14 different industries, and in every one of them, the understanding that equipment doesn't have to fail doesn't exist as a culture still today, and we could talk about why that is. But it was a rude awakening, really, to learn that people had this belief system that equipment ultimately is going to fail, it's going to wear out, and that maintenance is here to fix it when it's broken. Versus having a culture and a belief system that says equipment doesn't have to fail and equipment failure should be rare.
You bring up such a good point, because you're totally right. In many other industries, like, failure is kind of like, it's almost accepted as, a part of life. But then you bring that to the aviation industry, you bring that to the nuclear industry, and that is unacceptable, obviously.
That's right.
So it is a very interesting take on what reliability means to different industries. And it kind of puts it in a perspective of, are we just accepting just the way that things have always been and not the way that things have to be?
A lot of so culturally, I think there's an impediment to adopting best practices that have been very successful in those two industries. Maintenance and operations, maintenance owns it when it's broken, operations owns it when it's operating. That's wrong, but that's the prevalent culture. But there's also technical drivers, I think, for why most companies are still quite reactive, even after almost 60 years. It's incredible. And that is that, the culture of maintenance post-World War II was based on an understanding that was false at the time. It eventually came clear it was false, that all equipment wore out in a predictable pattern on the basis of time, and that all we need to do is intervene right before that acceleration of the degradation, right before the failure, the wear out zone, if you will. And that spawned preventive maintenance. Well, preventive maintenance was the way, time-based, calendar-based intervention was the way everybody did it, for generations upon generations. And so there hasn't yet been, I think, an acceptance and understanding in general industry that most equipment, really 89% of equipment on average, doesn't observe a time-based predictable wear out pattern, as you well know, Ryan. And so preventive maintenance, time-based, calendar-based intervention is absolutely inappropriate for most equipment. And yet that's the majority of the maintenance strategy that exists out there.
Yeah. I mean, it's exactly what we see as well. And I have a feeling that it is one mental barrier to get over that. But then two, I do believe that there is a cost associated with it. Because if you want to move from just, very simple, every 6 months, every 12 months, do X, Y, or Z, to, monitoring the health, the status through condition-based monitoring maintenance, there is a cost that is incurred there. I'd be curious, like, how do you advise companies to choose one method or the other? Because at the end of the day, I do understand that there's a risk, there's a cost, and there's a failure associated to every single outcome.
We first of all start out with a business case to try to help the particular, and we try to get executive sponsorship as early as possible. Without that, there's a limit to what you can do. At that nuclear plant, there was a $2 million a day lost revenue opportunity if that plant loses its operating license. That's $750 million a year. The executive management team's quite concerned about that. It's a $1 billion asset to start with, generating almost $1 billion a year in revenue. It's very strategic to the company. What is the business case for each place that we go to, I think, is where you have to start. But I think one of the cultural problems is that lots of money, hundreds of millions of dollars has been spent on implementing EAM systems, implementing various technologies. I think most companies have pretended to deploy predictive technologies, for example, by looking at the big three: vibration, infrared, and oil analysis, and applying them only to critical equipment. And it's based on, again, a false belief system that particularly among operators, that this stuff is expensive. So we want to limit its deployment to the most critical assets. Well, 80% of the maintenance budget is spent on balance of plant equipment, not the most critical equipment. And if you're going to get your maintenance spend down to 2% of replacement asset value, which is what the top performers are doing in every industry, you have to focus on all of the equipment and really allowing time-based intervention on the majority of that equipment looks to the executives like we've spent a lot of money on Maximo and SAP and all these EAM systems and all of these technical programs, and we've gotten nowhere. We're still in a reactionary maintenance mode. We're still having unexpected equipment failures. We've retuned our work management process of planning, scheduling. We've tried to train our operators on setting good priorities right at the beginning of that workflow, and yet we're not getting anywhere. Well, the problem, I think, is that it's all what I learned most importantly is that every one of these different elements alone doesn't drive any benefit whatsoever. It's how they all link together that drives the value. So the first link in the chain of events is the initiation of a problem, a work request that suggests that we may have a machine problem coming about. If that happens by virtue of the 5 human senses on the part of the operators, it's already an advanced failure. I know I'm speaking to the choir when I'm speaking to you, but I think it'll bring it all together for what we try to tell our clients, and that is you got to focus on that first link in the chain, because even if you've optimized your CMMS system, your priority system, your planners are selected properly and they're trained well, and your schedule compliance is still low, and your productivity and your wrench time is still low, because 80% of the work that you're running through that work management process is urgent. You didn't get advanced warning that gives you the time to plan and schedule, and therefore result in more optimum, more productive, more efficient execution of the work, allowing people time to do precision repairs that they can be proud of, that they can say, hey, I'm willing to put my signature on that work I just did. I'm a craftsman. My father, my grandfather taught me how to do this. And now, unfortunately, we don't have that pride in workmanship out there in most plants. And it's because management is not providing the right context to allow them to add value to the business. It's gotten that way over the course of many, many years. So I think the most important element is to figure out how to drive those predictive technologies deep into the asset base, not just on the critical equipment. And you can't do it all at once because you'll end up identifying way more corrective work than the current organization can handle. So you've got to start with the most critical and work your way up. But ultimately, over the course of 4 or 5 years, you can break that reactive cycle and get to a place where, failures are unusual here.
Yeah.
It happens. I mean, we take people to places that have already accomplished that.
Yeah. I mean, what I gather so much from that, Bob, is like, it's not about just trying to predict failures right before they happen. But what I hear from you is like, how do you go earlier within the life cycle before a failure even becomes, sensible to our own 5 senses? And generally what that means is not just, high vibration here, but it's, getting deeper into the value chain earlier on in that, let's call it like bathtub curve of failure, to start better predicting failure. Is it safe to say that's what, let's call it like the nuclear industry and the aviation industry have done to really make failures like a thing of the past and a very, very rare occurrence?
Absolutely. And I would say particularly in the aviation industry, where all of those different failure curves that we're so familiar with and the P to F curve was born. The analysis they did, spawned the knowledge that, the famous bathtub curve doesn't represent but a small fraction of the equipment in a typical industrial plant. And that most equipment doesn't have a wear out zone. And most interestingly, the infant mortality phenomenon that happens, that's a high probability of failure at the initial commissioning. That's not just when the equipment first goes into service, but it's every time it's taken out of service for maintenance and put back into service. That high probability of failure happens again. So we want to, as you suggested, detect early warnings. Now we're moving into predictive analytics realms where we're starting to marry operational data with equipment health information like pressures and temperatures and flows. That's where the industry is ultimately going, so we can be more and more accurate and get earlier and earlier on the P to F curve. Why are we doing that? So we can know when it's going to fail? No, as you suggest, we're doing that because we want to give this work management process and the materials management process that goes with it, a chance to do its benefit. And if we're in an urgent mode, planning and scheduling is a futile exercise. You're never going to have high schedule compliance. Operators are never going to trust the schedule. So they're not going to cool the equipment down and lock it and tag it out before maintenance shows up in the morning because the schedule says we're going to do that tomorrow. 90% of the time, maintenance doesn't show up when the schedule says, because 15 other things happened overnight. That's the equipment is running us. We're not running the equipment. And, the frustrating part is that, it doesn't have to be that way. That's the frustrating thing to me. So to get the executives to appreciate all of this, we have to build a business case. And, at that nuclear plant, I described it. It was not only a financial business case, but it was a reputational business case. The company had, it was providing electricity for more consumers in the United States than any other company in the world at that time across 8 states. So its reputation was critical. If they lost their license to operate that plant, it would have been catastrophic for the company. What's that business case at every other company? There is one at every single company, and it's big enough to get the attention of the executive management team in every case.
This is actually a really good discussion here, Bob, because I think the case around nuclear, obviously you've got like $1 billion in revenue at stake here. The case of aviation, you have lives at stake here. But I do also believe that in some businesses, some industries, let's call it manufacturing, like the business case is almost like you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what you're going to find. Any like tips, advice, recommendations on that?
One of the things we have to focus on to get that attention is uptime or downtime, the converse of that. Everybody experiences downtime in two categories: unscheduled and scheduled. When you do a PM optimization exercise using failure analysis, you understand how the machines behave, and now you look at the PMs that have been on the books for decades usually, and you find a real misalignment. That most of the PMs are not addressing those now known failure modes. So by suggesting that some of those PMs should be eliminated, there's a cultural barrier to that, because operators get very nervous when you're taking away what they consider to be the security blanket, but it's actually adding no value. It's actually doing more damage than good, because it's inducing failures every time you take that machine in and out of service. We're eliminating a significant amount of scheduled downtime.
Yeah.
Those PMs don't have to be done. It's usually about 50% of the existing PMs that end up going away after one of these analysis-based optimization programs. So calling that out, putting a spotlight on that scheduled downtime is really interesting. But now looking at the unscheduled downtime, executives focus on that like a laser beam. Unscheduled down. The CEO gets a call when a big paper machine goes down in a big pulp and paper company, for example. They know what that downtime is, and they believe there's a certain amount of downtime that is inevitable. That's a false belief system. It's not. It could be much better than what they believe it can be. And what their context is, their careers. It's never been any better than this. Well, you've never deployed any of this technology in the science before, like they have in the aviation industry and in the nuclear power industry. And that opens up a whole new set of possibilities.
I feel like, even in this conversation, Bob, my like, I need to shift my way of thinking too, because to your point, there is always a business case. If downtime is more than zero, which it almost always is in every single plant that I've stepped foot into, and a lot of our customers, if downtime is more than zero, there is a business case there.
Absolutely.
You don't have
without
to
even going into the maintenance spend reduction or the material spend reduction. Remember, materials is overlooked often. 50 cents of every dollar in the developed world, 40 to 60 cents is spent on parts versus labor. I mean, it's a huge part of the maintenance spend. So if you want to drive your maintenance costs down to world-class levels, you got to focus on all that productivity stuff we've been talking about. But usually 3 to 5 times that opportunity exists in the downtime. Later, early adopters like Cargill and DeFasco Steel and Eli Lilly started doing this, analyzing failure modes and looking at our PMs and realizing, oh boy, most of our PMs are not adding any value at all. Let's get rid of a lot of them. That's going to free up manpower to do the things that we didn't think we had the time to do, like doing more vibration, et cetera. And it starts this cycle, this whole chain of events all links together. And now all of a sudden we have a little bit more of our backlog identified early enough to allow planning and scheduling to do some good. So productivity of the workforce starts to go up a little bit more manpower is freed up to do a little bit more predictive technology and shifting that. It's just a very easy to understand transformation. But in those 3 companies I just told you about, I know I'm being long-winded, but this is an important point. They were privately owned companies. Okay, DeFasco Steel, Eli Lilly, and Cargill were privately owned companies. They didn't have to worry about satisfying Wall Street's expectations from a quarterly earnings perspective. And I think that's one of the reasons why they were as successful as they were in setting down the markers of best practices for us in practical terms in the 80s and 90s. That's when these companies did this with a lot of help from people like me. In the public companies, I have one example. I won't name the company. It's an iconic chemical company with 200 plants, been around for hundreds of years. And they had a new CEO who discovered, much to her chagrin, that they had most of their plants were third quartile performers. And she asked this task force to develop the business case for them. We helped them with that. And it was $700 and something million a year in excess maintenance spend and $1.3 billion a year in additional profits that were part of this business case. So she immediately launched this big initiative. We're going to focus on a handful of plants in Europe and the US as a pilot and eventually roll it out to all the plants. We would focus on the high value targets first. And the first quarter of the launch of that program, they missed their expectations on Wall Street. And she canceled the project. The courage to stand up to Wall Street and say, I'm going to put my mark on this company as the CEO of being able to guarantee you and have a high reliably forecast of earnings for you on a quarter-to-quarter basis. And I'm an industrial company. The way I deliver earnings is through my physical assets. Yep. If I don't have any downtime, I'm going to have a much better chance of being able to deliver the results that we're asking, that we're telling you we're going to deliver. When the Wall Street analysts start asking questions about the asset management program, we're going to be home. I've been waiting my whole life, Ryan, for this to happen. Preaching as loud as I can to many, many CEOs, but they are still beholden to those Wall Street analysts. And we've really got to get that finally to change, because yes, it's going to take some investment and longer term thinking. It can't change from reactive to proactive in 2 or 3 quarters. It takes on average 4 to 6 years to do that. Yeah. And to be able to weather that storm on Wall Street requires somebody to be able to stand up and articulate, we're going to have some rocky roads here in terms of the next 2 or 3 years, but here's my vision, here's my strategy. Yeah. This is how we're going to drive shareholder value in this company, and it's going to be better than it could have been any other way.
There's so many good nuggets in there, Bob. There's so much, but here's like one thing that I really took away. We kind of talk about like the investment in a reliability program. And oftentimes that is the barrier to getting a lot of these programs launched. But what I heard from you was actually, it really helped shift the entire narrative. What you said was the first thing you ought to do is actually look at PM optimizations. And when you look at PM optimizations, what you're doing is actually freeing up resources oftentimes. You're reducing scheduled downtime. So now operations is happier. And now with the additional manpower that you have, you can start investing that back into predictive technologies to reduce the second component of unscheduled downtime. Correct. And in my eyes, I think a very great way of looking at this, because, we talk to our customers all the time. And the biggest challenge is often, if we want to do anything extra, we have to go make the ask to hire more headcount. And oftentimes we need a full reliability engineer. We need a vibration analyst. We need X, Y, Z to add on top of what we already have. Right. But what I hear you saying is, you can actually get away with a lot.
You have to build that credibility. Eventually, now the credibility is so high and the business results are so good that now when you go up and say, I need $3 million to go replace our EAM system, or I need $5 million to implement a predictive analytics capability, you're going to get attention because you've already delivered tens of millions of dollars of benefits for the business, right? But you got to start someplace. We as maintenance people have been very bad at making good presentations and talking to executives. We're wrench turners. That unfortunately there are not a lot of strong communicators and not a lot of strong business people in the maintenance ranks, and that's been one of the problems, I think.
I mean, and it's also so important in moving up in careers, the ranks within companies, is putting together that business case, right. Being able to communicate the why, put together the return on investment, because at the end of the day, that's oftentimes what executives are looking at.
Yeah, and you got to go up and talk their language. You can't go in and talk about what is vibration and what does it do for us. Well, we're going to be able to measure the waveform, and what, if it's 1 times rotating speed, it's probably a misalignment problem or a balance problem. Excuse me. If it's 2 times, you won't get anywhere with the exec. You got to talk their language, which is financial. Ultimately, I learned their language. They're the guys that are running these companies and gals, And once I did that, everything changed, really.
Bob, thank you so much for sharing all of the knowledge around this. This has been great. At the very end of our show, what I always like to do is do a quick fire set of questions where we can leave our audience with a few extra golden nuggets of information. So basically, I'll ask you a question and get your response in 20 seconds or less. How does that sound? You ready?
Okay, I'll try.
All right. Best advice a mentor ever gave to you about, your career, the industry?
It would have to be that's what the person that helped me understand that first link in the chain. That is the triggering event that tells us we have an early warning sign of an impending problem. To me, that's the most important piece that unlocked all of the benefits of all the rest of those links in that chain.
I love it. And obviously that's what I'm guessing spurred your 43 years of this industry and being in this industry.
Yep.
All right. Something that you wish more people knew about, the maintenance reliability industry?
I wish more people understood that equipment failure is not inevitable, that equipment does not have to fail, and that an environment can exist where equipment failures are rare.
Yeah, that's really, really key. I mean, even for me in this conversation today, if you could change one thing about our industry, what would it be?
Probably to educate the Wall Street analysts, so they can start asking the questions that really matter about reliability of forecasting earnings. If it's an industrial company, it's not going to work for a financial services company, but for an industrial company that makes its money through physical assets, start asking questions of the CEO about the physical asset management strategy of the company.
Biggest takeaway you hope all of our listeners are going to take away from today's conversation?
Understand that the planning and scheduling and the work management processes that have been the subjects of so much spending and attention can't deliver their results if you don't have early warnings of impending machine problems. So it's almost the same answer as your earlier question, but again, without that early warning, all the rest of this stuff has been deployed for my whole career and it hasn't driven results. Why? I think it's because of that initiating link in the chain. So I think that's probably the most important nugget.
Bob, really appreciate you taking the time. Can you share with all of our listeners the different ways that they can connect with you and follow you on your journey?
Sure. It's DiStefano, DISTEF as in Frank, AN as in Nancy, O, at pcaconsulting.com. And I'm on LinkedIn, Robert DiStefano. Yeah, those are probably the 2 best ways to get a hold of me quickly.
Awesome. Thank you again, Bob, for joining us. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in to today's episode of the Maintenance Mavericks Podcast. Again, my name is Ryan. I'm the CEO and founder of UpKeep. You can connect with me on LinkedIn or shoot me an email directly at ryan@upkeep.com. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode, and I look forward to connecting with all of you soon. And until next time, Bob, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Ryan. So do I. Take care.